this.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your, I just crashed into a wall host, Madelyn.
What?
Like, I did it, not my car or my character. I just crashed into a wall.
Okay. I'm your... that wasn't my fault host, Emma.
And thanks for tuning in to this week's show. As you no doubt did not guess from those very themed intros, this week we're going to be talking, as promised, about player identification with characters in video games. So what makes you refer to things in the first person or not when you're talking about playing a game? What makes you see the character as you? When and why is this a thing that developers would want you to do? And is it always something that we have to have in our games?
Yeah.
So that's what's up on Talk This.
Yeah.
It does seem like something that would have been inspired by last week's episode on Miitopia. However, it was not. Miitopia, I think...
I don't know if I really identify with the characters in Miitopia.
It's sort of different, perhaps, right? But, you know, it is kind of the ultimate in. You're literally putting yourself into the story.
I guess so. You're right.
But you are right to say, of course, that then the characters can behave in ways that may not seem appropriate, right? Like Sims, they go on to have their own little personalities.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, my point being that this was actually an idea that I had been kicking around for the July 4th edition of the show until we remembered that it was, in fact, on July 4th and decided to get ourselves on the FBI watch list instead.
We love theming. That's a lie. We don't.
We've gotten a little better at theming lately. We often think of themes when the thing is happening, but then it's not not turn to pick for another 6 weeks.
And we can't really be blamed for the main episodes, because that's just the luck of the draw.
You can be blamed.
Why can I be blamed?
Well, there's no reason that you couldn't. As far as I know, you could just be picking those games.
My integrity is why we don't have themes.
So probably best to start this week by talking about what does it even mean to identify with a character in a game?
Kind of a trickier question than it seems at first, to be honest.
That's why there are philosophers to think about these kinds of things.
Is it a philosophy? Is it in the realm of philosophy to think about identifying with a character in media?
I think so. And I'm sure Clickbait Boyfriend would think so. Philosophy of games is definitely a thing, and so thinking about, especially what does it mean when you talk about a character as you, but it isn't you, ties into a lot of philosophical discourse about art in general. That's, what does it mean? How involved are you in watching a performance of Hamlet or something like that? Are you part of that world? What is it? Of course, philosophy of games is a new field. It definitely, this sort of idea of, what are you feeling, and are your feelings quote-unquote real when you're engaging with a fictional world, is definitely something with philosophical underpinnings, but also just game studies. And also just, people thinking studies.
I love people thinking studies.
Me too, sometimes.
My favorite class in college.
People thinking studies
People
101.
Thinking studies. An introduction to brain. Definitely circumstantially, what makes games sort of stand out on this topic as compared to other forms of media is, you or I would certainly use you or I a lot more frequently when talking about games than I would when talking about a movie.
Yes, I would never be like, I took the hobbits to Isengard.
Yeah.
Yes.
Unless you're... That's Gandalf? Does he do that?
Let's not expose the lack of specific Lord.
I was just gonna say, unless you're Ian
McKellen.
Then you can say
Even then, there would still be some questions about, okay, did Ian McKellen take the hobbits to Isengard, or did, again, it's a fictional world. But you're right. It's a similar idea in that if he considered his Lord of the Rings time as kind of a LARPing experience, then perhaps. Which it kind of was. It does seem like that is kind of how these things happen.
Well, I know for him, it was like a lot of acting with green screen and like forced perspective stuff, and he hated it. Is like the common story that is told about that. So maybe he wouldn't say I took the hobbits. He would say I stood in front of a green screen for hours.
Anyway, Emma makes the excellent point though. That, if you're watching a movie or a TV show, or even for the most part reading a book, with very rare exceptions, one of the papers that I read in preparation for this does mention this NYC HQ favorite, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, which is written entirely in second person. So perhaps with that book, you could discuss yourself as having, engaged in the all very metaphorical and strange action that is typical of Calvino novels. But for the most part, in most fictions, you're expected to just sit there and watch, right?
Yes.
And it would be weird for you to ever use a first-person identifier to talk about what's happening, because, of course, you are not involved as anything other than a watcher.
Yes. Even in books where you would read it in the first person.
Yeah. Unless it was a particularly, again, obviously there are always exceptions for particularly experimental work. I'm sure there's a way you could write a first-person book that was intended for the reader to experience as character. That it would be very difficult and a lot less natural than even in games where it's like, oh, but like really you're not at all like that situations. It's a lot easier to apply to the most inappropriate game for that kind of reference than it is for the most appropriate book, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
But yeah, identification is really kind of hard to pin down, because it gets into this idea of how much of this do you really believe, kind of, right? For me, it's hard to read any of this. Like, sometimes people get into things where it's like, people really think they are the character. And it's like, well, but, like, do they? Really? Mm-hmm. A lot of the scientific studies on this rely on, self-report surveys from people. And that in particular, it's just like, okay, like, it's hard to talk about these kinds of experiences and really say, okay, but, like, you don't really think you're Lara Croft. You're just, like, kind of identifying in a way that's a little more nebulous than that. But it's interesting to try to kind of figure out what that is.
Yeah. Because something that was coming up in reading a lot of things is that there's definitely a distinct difference between, like, caring about a character or feeling attached to a character and actually, like, identifying with the character. Like, those are distinct feelings that you have. And I would say that a large amount of games mostly just want you to feel attached to the character, not necessarily identify and be them, if that makes sense.
So I think that's true to a certain extent. I will say that plenty of studies show, though, that the more a player identifies with a character, and again, all of these studies need to be taken with a grain of salt of their psychological studies and, replication, crisis, any of that good stuff. And even in reading these, I was like, these are not especially comprehensive, right? But plenty of studies show that the more a player identifies with a character, whatever the study defines that as being, the more likely they are to enjoy the game, to, it's tied in with flow and immersion and that kind of thing. So I'll agree, and that I don't think it's necessarily necessary that the player identify with the character. See, I'm already mixing up player and character here.
What if the character identifies with you?
So that is something interesting that I was reading, that not exactly what you're saying here. That would be really scary. But that some of identification isn't so much that... Okay, I'm going to see if I can explain this right. It's not so much you seeing yourself as the character. It's... No, wait, I didn't set that up. I didn't set up that parallel right. It's not that you think you're the character. It's that you think the character is you, kind of. It kind of flows both ways, in that there's a benefit in characters that look like you and act like you, and that kind of similarity identification. But there's also kind of a backflow to it sometimes, where we want to identify with characters that are courageous, or morally upright, or just hotties, or whatever, and that by playing as those characters, we start to see ourselves as more courageous, morally upright hottie than we otherwise would.
And the notes for that, I was thinking about, like, you wrote a note that was, like, raising self-esteem of the player, basically, by playing characters that are good at their jobs. And I just gotta say, sometimes it just came up to me when I read that. I was like, I remember playing Disco Elysium and feeling better about myself. Which was not, he's not good at his job in Disco Elysium.
But I think that's I think that's the exception that proves the rule.
Uh-huh.
The Disco Elysium, probably does make you feel better about yourself because this person just, like, kills himself on the, like, putting on a tie.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But that apparently in studies, and this bears out in places where people can choose their own avatar too, which obviously is going to be a big thing, what we talk about, but that you have this kind of idea of wishful identification that, you know, instead of it being like, yes, I'm thinking about what I would do if I was Nathan Drake running around, right? Instead, you're just feeling like you are more like Nathan Drake than you actually are. That, like, you are adventurous and a mass murderer. Just kidding. And swashbuckling and whatever. Which I had not really ever thought about before. I hadn't ever really thought about it from what feels like that backwards perspective of not just I'm putting myself in the game, but I'm, like, putting the game in me, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I do think Ian.
I can't believe that I picked a topic that is going to require us to both engage with Ian Bogost and The Last of Us 2. I saw your
We don't have to. We don't have to engage with them. We do have to engage with the Ian article because I think it brings up some things to discuss. We don't necessarily have to engage with The Last of Us 2.
I don't believe that real Ian Bogost identifies with Ian Bogost, the byline. I don't believe
I don't
that he
necessarily
sees himself.
think so either. I think he comes up with topics and writes about them. But I will say there was something interesting in his do video games need, or video games are better without characters. He doesn't even pose it as a question. He's just like, no. Where he was talking about how, like, the entitlement of, like, gamers, right? And I do think about occasionally, like, stories that are centered around the protagonist versus stories that aren't, right? Like, when it comes to, like, choice-based games where you are given, like, great sweeping control of the narrative and what that actually means in terms of the person playing it, you know? And you were mentioning, like, you know, you feel more like this, you feel cooler, you feel better, and, like, self-esteem is good. Don't get me wrong.
That's the pull quote from this episode.
Feel good about yourself. But I do wonder if there's something salient, and not just in video games, but in media in general, of, like, feeling like you're the important one, I guess. And whether that plays into, like, the way that we act in certain situations.
I just think Ian puts too much on games here. Look, I don't disagree that he's right to say, look, this was a new form of artistic medium and it could have chosen to tell different stories than all the ones we already have. But, you know, given that Western society, at least, is structured around this ideal of the rugged individualism. It does feel a little disingenuous to imagine that games would be like, no, we're gonna tell collectivist stories here.
Yes. Basically, if you haven't read this article, it's a few years old now, but...
If you haven't read this article, it's an article a normal person would have written would have been like, I would like more SimCity games. And instead, Ian wrote, only SimCity. We missed an opportunity by making a game ever that was not SimCity. Should have been the only game.
I remember we read a lot of his articles in my narrative for games class, and we would always come into the classroom and professor would be like hoping we would have like a interesting discussion about it, and we'd all come in and be like, I don't know, man, the vibes suck. I don't like it. Do I really have to academically explain why? And it was never particularly fruitful. But anyway, if you haven't read it, he's basically talking about how games are sort of uniquely positioned as a form of media to talk about systems over characters, and that he thinks that games would be better served going in that direction to like stand out more from like just being bad movies, basically. Which I think Ian just doesn't play interesting video games, for one thing. And maybe he should branch out. And, like, I'll agree with him. I think procedurally generated stuff and stuff like The Sims and, stuff like that is really interesting. I think it's really interesting in terms of taking control away, too, because neither the player or the developer is particularly in control of what comes out of that experience, right? Like, the developers have set up all these competing parts to, like, talk to each other, but they don't know what conversations they're going to have, necessarily. And that's what makes that stuff interesting, but also, like, I don't know, why is The Sims so much more successful than SimCity is because you have these little creatures walking around, like, telling stories that you have to react to. I just generally think that, when you study systems, if you don't think about the individuals within those systems, you lose your understanding of why those systems are the way they are anyway. So,
but basically what you're saying is that if someone showed Ian the 100 Baby Sims challenge, that he would change his mind.
I don't know. I think Ian should play games like Frostpunk, for example. Where you're, like, running a city, but that city is full of, like, individuals, and he should see what he thinks of that.
All of this is coming from the perspective, probably, like, Ian probably played Civilization, and Gandhi nuked him, and he was like, I don't like characters anymore.
Yes, Ian, play Civilization. It's got tons of systems, but it's also got characters. You can have it both, Ian. Those are my game recommendations to you.
I also just don't appreciate that he is only drawing the parallel. It's like, it either has to be, it's a bad movie, or, like, he's drawing this false dichotomy between, games that could tell different stories that are more systems-based, and games that could tell different stories that are more diverse. And it's like, my dude, not everything has to be for you. It's okay that you don't love narrative-driven games and that you prefer movies. That's fine. Just because you like those systems-based games doesn't mean that the story... And just, like, the false equivalency of, like, we're just gonna drop the Minority of the Week into a sci-fi game. It's like, no, that's not... I mean, that's sort of what some people are... That's what the industry gives you when you ask for this. But that's not really what people are asking for. They're asking for more diverse stories and more opportunities to have characters to identify with that are either like them or not like them. Anyway, that part of the article I found especially frustrating and disingenuous, because it's like, fine, you make some fair points here about these stories not having been prioritized on a large scale, but, like, you don't have to be, like, to draw this false equivalency to make that point.
All is to say, we do not identify with the character named Ian Bogost.
I'd like to. I'd like a game that would make me identify with Ian Bogost so I could just understand him.
I do think so. He writes articles with a topic, and even if he might, like, hedge in real life, like, there is something to be said about just making an argument and sticking to it without being like, on the other hand. Because you don't necessarily always have to do that in things that you write.
Anyway, I appreciate his belief that games, if only we had made more SimCity games, maybe we would have risen up in a proletariat revolution by now.
Society, if SimCity was more successful. Have you seen that meme?
No.
It's just like this picture of like green and like flying cars, and you do like society at the top and then like something stupid at the bottom.
Oh no. I will say one area in which Ian is not totally wrong is, so you mentioned this too, and I'll just circle back on this idea that by telling these kind of like individualistic stories that we reinforce that kind of cultural ethos, that cultural myth of the hero, of the protagonist. The joke that I made to Emma when I suggested this was like, oh yeah, by August everyone will be vaccinated and we'll all be having like our like exciting protagonist summers. And wasn't that a fun thing to think in early July? Wasn't that a fun idea to have?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But what he is right in pointing out, and whatever, Emma and I argue on this show all the time, that of course games can have an impact on you. But in terms of player identification with characters, we do see a lot of protagonist characters that but also are like ID'd by people as hypermasculine and violent and aggressive. And when players play those games and self-report as identifying with those characters, they then also exhibit more kind of physical telltale things, whether that's heart rate or whatever, of aggression. And not to take that to the, like, boneheaded conclusion of video games cause violence, but there is something to be said about, like, there's a powerful impact to creating a character that people see themselves in, however you want to define that.
Do any of those studies, like, measure long-term effects, though, or is it all short-term?
So that was one thing I didn't love about a lot of these, is that it was like, oh, really? Like, what are you really learning about player identification from playing one level of Battlefield 2? Like, you're obviously checking into a different kind of identification than what I'm particularly interested in there. Not to say that there's, like, not something to learn there, but it just feels like a different level of identifying with the character. I'm not sure. As is often the case with academic papers, many of them are locked behind aggressive paywalls. So I didn't run into any that looked at things over a more long-term playing experience. That doesn't mean they're not out there, but they aren't the ones that you can get free PDFs of.
Yes.
Or maybe they are and I just didn't get to them.
That's fine.
Possible. I was impressed to see some of them measuring more physical symptoms, though. I not symptoms. Yikes, that's too harsh. Physical embodiments of these kinds of things. I feel like so many video game studies are self-report surveys of male college students, and it's just like, come on.
I just always wonder with, like, short-term ones, like, in general, if you're thinking about violence and then they measure your heart rate, like, shortly afterwards, like, does that really have anything to do with identification, or is it because you've been playing a high-octane game for an hour?
So that's, I think, fair. I do think that the studies that I read, and again, I was mostly reading these as citations in other people's studies, so take this at the level of nuance that is appropriate for that. But it did seem like there was a correlation between people who said they identified more strongly and that physical response. Whether or not that's particularly significant, who knows? Probably the scientists.
Probably.
So, should we talk a bit about what makes you identify with a character?
Sure.
Emma, what makes you identify with a character? It's a personal interview show now.
Oh, personally? I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I really have characters that I, like, come to mind as, like, oh, I identify with this character, to be perfectly honest.
I mean, that's fair. The word identify is so open and empty that seems valid.
Yeah, like, I have characters I care about. I have characters that mean something to me, but to say, like, oh, I identify with this character because of yada, 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 I don't know if that's necessarily true for any, not even just in games.
I think that's what's so difficult about these studies, is that, yeah, when you're not actually playing the game, I think it's a lot easier to have that kind of sense of, like, yeah, like, I don't literally think that I'm Sora, right? Like, I can talk about Sora as a character, or even make dumb cracks about Sora doing dumb stuff when I'm playing, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, take that with any game character that I've played over time. But when I'm playing, I will still find myself saying, like, oh man, I shouldn't have done that, or I died, or yes, I leveled up, or something like that. And so, like, what is that disconnect between, even with characters where, you know, I'm trying to do this with characters that it's like, no, in any other circumstance, like, I do talk about them as characters. Obviously, this gets even murkier when you're dealing with something that's, like, barely a character and really much more designed to be kind of a self-insert situation.
Yes. And we can talk about self-insert and then avatars, I think, after this, probably.
Yeah. But that's something that I've been thinking about in prepping for this podcast. Is it's like, okay, why when I'm playing Kingdom Hearts? Why when I'm playing Yakuza? Why when I'm playing whatever? Even though, like, sometimes I have thoughts about these characters, and even when I'm playing, sometimes I have thoughts about these characters. It's like, oh my god, so-and-so did something dumb. Or, ha ha ha, like, what a clever move from so-and-so.
Yeah,
like,
I do think there's a key there. And you sort of mentioned this in terms of, like, ways that games disconnect you from the character. Because you are physically doing things. Like, when you say, oh, I died, it's because you were in a combat scenario and you didn't block, right? You didn't press the square button, and so the character died, right? So that's your action doing something. But, like, when I watch a cutscene, I don't say, oh, I got hit in the face by Leon, you know, or whatever, or I passed out, or whatever, because then that's not me doing it, right? It's the characters doing it. So there is something there of, like, when you are actively engaging with it versus not. I think a little bit of, like, if you're talking about, like, the way you might act a scene, and you're like, oh, I think you should be a little bit more angry. And it's like, okay, I'll try being a little bit more angry when I'm talking about this. And it's not you, right? Because it's the character being more angry, but you are doing the angriness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a particularly interesting analogy that I hadn't thought about before. Particularly because, so it's like, you could think of the difference between a direction of you should be more angry and you should cross stage right. Right? Mm-hmm. Or one of those, like the second one, could feasibly be interpreted as actually being a note to, like, Madelyn the actor. Like, Madelyn, you should cross stage right. Mm-hmm. As opposed to, assuming we're not in a strict, hardcore method acting program or something like that, saying, Madelyn, play this scene a little more angry. I mean, frankly, that's kind of a bad note, but whatever. I'm
sorry. I didn't go to acting class, okay?
Criticizing Emma's directing here. But saying, Madelyn, you should be more angry, or something that's more emotionally based, right? Does get into that murky territory of, okay, but, like, you're playing a character.
Yeah.
I mean, you could even get into, like, saying, Madelyn, you should throw the vase in this scene, is even potentially in kind of middle ground. But since you can maybe hand wave that as, like, okay, you're playing the character while you're doing that, but you are still physical. Anyway, it's a good analogy, Emma. I appreciate it. I don't know why I didn't think about it that way.
Anyway, I was thinking about it a little bit because I was playing The Great Ace Attorney in front of our mother while she was visiting me this weekend. And I had been talking about things like, I'm going to present this evidence now, or like, I don't think that I should do that. But then Mom asked me like, oh, but which one's you again exactly? And I was like, I guess I'm Ryunosuke. But it felt very weird to say it like that, to say like, I am this character, because I don't think about it like that in my head. It's a little different from saying, I'm going to present this evidence versus like, I am Ryunosuke Naruhodo, lawyer, you know?
Well, I think Ace Attorney is certainly different from many of the examples in studies on player identification in that, correct me if I'm wrong, I still have not played any of the Ace Attorney games, but it's functionally a puzzle game, right?
Yeah.
In terms of the actual gameplay mechanics. And obviously there's a lot of story around that and whatever, but it is a puzzle game.
Probably an adventure game, probably.
Okay, yeah, adventure in the old school style sense. So I understand the kind of hesitancy to identify yourself with the character there, because of course nothing about the way that you're searching for evidence has very much to do with the fact that, like, you are this specific character. It really is kind of you doing that. Like, you literally are looking around the space, and obviously it's a space on the screen, right? But what you, the person, are doing is not so different from what you, the character, is doing. There's, like, less distance. As opposed to, like, the example where you're like, I died because I didn't block. Well, like, you neither died, nor even if you'd been successful, would you have literally blocked. I don't know. It's interesting to me, kind of like, you feel more like you because you're doing more of what the character would do. Does that make any sense at all?
No, I was trying to say that even though I really don't feel like I am the character in that game, I still use those words.
Yeah.
I was trying to say between, like, actually being the character in the story versus playing the game. I feel like I use I when it comes to verbs about playing the game versus verbs about, like, how the character's feeling or any sort of identifying verbs, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think it's especially interesting that in games, obviously games can make you feel things, right? Let's talk this. I would never say games can't make you feel things. But I think the most common emotion that games make you feel is, like, frustrated or whatever when you die, right?
Sure.
Or something like that.
Yeah, what I mean is, like, if the character that I was playing was feeling angry, I wouldn't be like,
I'm angry.
I'm angry. Yeah. I guess I don't use I am a lot versus I did.
Yeah.
As a distinguishing point. I think that identification is more about the I am. I guess. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. That does make sense. I do think that's a harder level to achieve, though. You've set the bar for identification pretty high.
I guess so, but that's what the silent self-insert protagonists are for, isn't it?
Isn't it?
Because I will say, in contrast, in, like, Fire Emblem Three Houses, I don't really think about Byleth as someone distinct from me in any particular way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There's levels to this. I do kind of think of the...
I assume that changes in combat, right? Like, presumably you feel that more so when you're running around.
I guess so, yeah. Yeah, in combat, I guess it's a little different. Although I'm still... That's actually interesting, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because, like, even though I'm controlling the students in those scenarios, I wouldn't use I necessarily to describe, like, if they missed an attack.
it would be more unusual. I do notice sometimes kind of discrepancies in my, like you were saying, like, oh, I wouldn't, like, talk through what happened in a cutscene using I. I think I do sometimes, but not in a consistent way. Just in a, sometimes it's easier to talk about it that way. I is one syllable. So it's a little easier for me to say, oh yeah, they called me back from Okinawa again. My fall plans, Okinawa, the Delta variant.
I guess so.
Dokuma Daijo. But, there's my meme of the week. But you're right to say that in those situations, I would be much more likely to use the student's name than I would to say I. Not that that's what I think is interesting about this, is we sprinkle in I's all over the place in games, and not necessarily in ways that are super consistent internally.
That's true. But anyway, I do think the whole silent protagonist thing is a way to encourage more forward identification, right? Versus the, I guess, backwards in terms of the backwards identification you were talking about, where you feel more like the character.
Yeah,
like in
not
those
much to
cases,
feel like the character.
Yeah, in those cases, they're trying to get you to be the character, basically, and to live vicariously. And that's particularly true in games where you actually have, like, an avatar that you can create for yourself.
Yeah, it was interesting to me to discover that even though my intuition was that first-person games would more actively encourage kind of seeing yourself as the character, that's not actually really consistently the case. Not to say that third person necessarily is, like, better for that, but it's certainly not worse. And then there's a lot of kind of trade-offs to, okay, you're, like, looking from the perspective of the character, but you also don't have a body, or maybe you just have arms. So that was not something I had thought about. And then, of course, as Emma was rightfully transitioning toward here, the importance of the player-created avatar.
Yeah, I had read an article that was talking a little bit about, like, first-person scenes in movies and how you can use that to hide information from the player. So I was thinking, like, well, from the viewer, yes, from the viewer in the movie case. I was transitioning into talking about first-person games. So, like, with that, I was thinking, like, yeah, it makes sense maybe that you wouldn't necessarily feel as attached to the character or identify with the character if you're uncertain of what is actually there behind the camera.
Right. Am I playing as a giant slug?
Yeah, exactly.
But in that case, it feels like what those games want to do is just encourage you to imagine it's literally you. And it's interesting to discover that that's actually, like, hard for players.
Yeah. I mean, if there's any sort of story going on, I don't know. It feels weird, doesn't it? Because I was thinking about, like, you brought up, like, a racing game, and I was like, oh, I'd use I in that scenario, no problem. Like, that's a first-person game, but, like, it's just cars racing around. Of course I would use I. I wouldn't say the driver.
Yeah.
But, like, something like, you know, like BioShock Infinite or Halo or whatever. I'm not going to say... it's a little weirder to be like, I am Master Chief.
Well, what if it's...
Or Master Chief is me, I guess is the better way to put it.
More of a one-to-one comparison. I don't know that I would talk differently about playing Burnout as I would playing, like, Crash Team Racing. Right? I mean, I would talk differently about it in a lot of ways, but I wouldn't talk differently about it from the perspective of how I talked about the character, even though, obviously...
I guess that's fair.
In Crash Team Racing, you choose a character, and in Burnout, you just, like, pick a car.
Maybe that's just the nature of the style of game in that case, then.
Yeah.
Anyway, the reason that games let you make avatars is to help you feel more like the character.
That is so... In some ways, it's the most intuitive thing in the world. In other ways, when I think about myself designing characters for games, it suddenly feels much less intuitive. I often design characters that look like me simply because I am boring and have no ideas. That is really why. It's not because I'm particularly excited about having a character look like me. Granted, I definitely do say this from the perspective of a, like, blondish white woman of societally approved size.
Yeah.
Right? So, you know, in many ways, yeah, it's not that exciting for me to see, like, a blonde woman with a ponytail of semi-athletic build in a game. Like, oh, really? Like, groundbreaking. Could only have made that if I did it myself.
I mean, I definitely default in the rare game with a character creator that I've played to making, like, me, but cooler, you know?
But see, then you're exactly like what all of these studies say that people do. Which is, like, you want to make yourself, but just, like, a little bit more like you wish you looked. I often go, if either I'm doing me-ish, or I'm doing, like, they've got a mohawk, and it's purple, and they're 7 feet tall, kind of characters.
Isn't that just you, but cooler, though?
I guess so. I guess you're right. I won't deny that those characters are cooler than me, I guess. Whether they could feasibly be me, whether I could attain that level of cool, that's an open question.
You're saying, on the inside, I feel like a 7 foot tall lady with a giant purple mohawk, is what you're saying. You know?
I guess that is what I'm saying. But no, it isn't, because I don't identify with these characters. Very rare is the game with a character creator, and this is part of why I brought up Miitopia, because in Miitopia, you make the design, and that's all you look at in the game. That is the whole game. And not that, of course, that one doesn't just... They market it a lot as, like, you and your friends and family. But of course, obviously, everything we talked about last time of people making whatever literary games, movie characters they want for that one is fun, too. And that's sort of a different kind of a... I mean, it's like a fun from a choose-your-own-adventure fan fiction perspective, probably. But in so many of these games with character creators, you then never see your character ever again. Or you don't, like, you barely have to. It's like, you know, I made a dope character in Skyrim, Sweetheart McBabe II, and that neither that name nor the dope design that I have. I mean, you can play Skyrim in third person if you want to, but I don't really know why you would. Like, I never see it. And so even if I had made one that looked exactly like me, I can't imagine how that would change how I identified with the character.
Yeah, I guess it's... I mean, going back to, like, our discussion about, like, third person or first person, I do think the avatar is more effective in third person when you can see them.
Yeah. But there are so many first-person games that have these these intense character creators, and I'm like, what am I doing? I love a good character creator, but I'm gonna see this, like, 2 times in the game.
Yeah. I guess I think a lot about, like, MMORPGs, and, like, connecting that to, like, you talking about, I don't know if you brought it up or if it's just in notes, but, like, flow. Like, identification and flow. And, like, part of being an MMORPG is making sure that you maintain player interest over a long period of time. So, of course, you want them to make, like, a very cool-looking avatar that they can, you know, dress up in cool costumes and cosmetics and have a good time with. And so you find that a lot of those are in third person so that they can be looking at their avatar all the time, you know? Like, just from, like, the people who play Final Fantasy XIV who I follow for other reasons or or just pop up on my timeline because it's recommended or whatever.
Free trial up to level 60 with the Heavensward expansion?
Exactly. I should really get back to that at some point. I never will.
Put on your... Do you still have your Final Fantasy XIV scarf?
Oh, I don't know. It's buried in a box somewhere, probably. But anyway, like, everybody seems very attached to their warrior of light, you know? They seem to like them a lot, which is weird, because they're just, like, a little, seemingly all silent protagonist. that they've designed. But that's the key. They've designed them. It's their warrior of light. They feel connected to it, right? And that sort of makes it their story, even though, millions, enough people to crash the servers, are playing through this same experience at the same time.
Do you identify with your Fall Guy when you play?
A little. More than I would if they didn't let me dress up the Fall Guy,
One area, like, I get it with things like Final Fantasy XIV and whatever, Fall Guys. Who wouldn't identify? Fall Guy are the perfect identify. Doesn't everybody feel like a Fall Guy inside?
That's true.
But I don't, obviously, games like Fortnite make billions of dollars on people buying, collectibles.
Yeah.
And gear and skins. And I get that less. It's like you don't really get to look at your character in the way that you do.
Fortnite, stuff like Fortnite is, I think, less about identification and more about status. So you buy those things in order to stand out to the other people looking at you as someone who has put a lot of time into this game, or is really good at this game, or just has the cool stuff in this game. Which there certainly could be in stuff like Final Fantasy XIV. I don't know, really.
Well, I think
but
that's
just in
the
terms
case
of
in any community. That's going to
But just in terms of, like, avatar creation, you don't go to your Fortnite avatar. Like, there's people you can be, but you can't really, like, tweak them to your liking,
Yeah, that's fair.
So I think that's a little different. When it comes to, like, cosmetics and, like, skins, I feel like that sort of stuff is less about identifying with the thing that you're playing as and more about looking cool to everyone else playing.
I guess it feels like
Which is still identification, because that's, I guess, still an extension of you.
Yeah. Like, even if you're not looking at yourself, you know that other people are looking at you thinking you're cool.
Yeah.
And that is a big theme in avatar creation, in that when people play as avatars, either that they've made or that you get to pick from in these studies, that when people are playing as ones that are more quote-unquote attractive or whatever positive trait you want to pick, that they act more confidently and that kind of thing. Which, again, it's that reverse flow self-esteem stuff. You want to identify with the character that feels like it could be you, but it's, like, cooler than you. And then in turn it makes you more like that thing. And man, what a positive feedback loop. Unless the thing you want to be is a horrible, toxic man.
Yeah.
In which case maybe it's not a positive feedback loop.
Yeah. The key is horrible, toxic there.
Yeah.
Just to clarify.
Yes. Horrible, toxic, any gender of person, but in games, we know. So let's close it out a little bit here, I guess, by talking about times when games don't want us, or choices that games make either because they intentionally don't want us to identify with the character, or choices they make that risk losing that identification for other narrative goals.
Sure.
Here it is. The Last of Us Part 2. I really feel like this was such a... I mean, one, okay, whatever. Her arms. Got it. You can't identify with her because of her arms.
Yeah.
Fine.
Yeah, I don't know. I do go back and forth on parts of The Last of Us Part 2. It does not do this perfectly, but certainly I would argue that by the end of the game, it doesn't really particularly want you to be identifying with either of its main perspective characters.
Well, I feel like this was so much a part of the discourse around the game. I still haven't played it, of course, but I feel like I have. when it came out, this idea of the game is just like brutal and punishing and makes you do things that you wouldn't do. And of course, yeah, that is kind of unusual for games. I mean, sort of. Presumably you wouldn't run around shooting a bunch of people and, like, let's hope, right? Games make you do a lot of things you wouldn't do all the time. The Last of Us 2 just does it in ways that are coded as unpleasant. Yeah. As opposed to any of the normal things that, like, you wouldn't do.
Yeah. Like, there's one scene in The Last of Us Part 2 where it makes you press the square button in, like, a cutscene type scenario to beat a woman to death. And I think that's, like, that was a bad decision. In that, I just really don't think that the game wants you to, like, be embodying Ellie there. And I could see the argument both ways of either, like, they're trying to cement your identification of Ellie before switching perspectives on you, or they want that to be like, oh, like, now she's going too far in terms of, like, it kicks off with a rather traumatic event that might induce a player who gets really into games to be, like, fully invested in what Ellie is doing, I guess. So I sort of see why it's there. I think it doesn't work in either of those ways particularly well. I don't know what I was going to say before I got off on that tangent. But I felt like a lot of the articles were talking about, like, oh, she's going on a revenge quest, and that's stupid. And it's like, yeah. That's the point of the...
I think they know that.
Of the game.
I think the developers know that.
And there's plenty of arguments to be made about whether that lesson is, like, tired or, you know, it doesn't carry that well. But just saying, like, Ellie doing these... making me be Ellie while she does these things is bad is, like... I don't know what to say to that. Like, the game also agrees with you. So...
Yeah. It's interesting, I think, setting aside the question of whether all of it works, right? Because that's gonna be dependent on you as the player and how you're feeling about any number of these things and how identified you are and that sort of thing, what you bring to the table. But it's obvious that the team here is intentionally playing with, you know, when are you pulling the player in with immersion and when are you actively alienating them? And obviously that's, like, a quick time event I think is an interesting, that makes you do something you don't want to do is interesting on a couple of levels there. Again, just putting aside the idea of, like, does this work narratively or does it accomplish what it wants to accomplish? Like, I appreciate the thinking of, like, on one hand, by making the player play, you're, like, encouraging immersion, right? It's easy to check out when you're watching a cutscene. And so, like, you're forcing the player to, like, stay engaged with the game by asking them to, like, game and not to turn on movie viewer brain.
Yeah.
Right? But at the same time, you're asking them to do something that probably the player wouldn't choose to do. Yeah. Most players, anyway, wouldn't choose to do that if you have the choice. So it's an interesting push and pull between something that's, like, encouraging immersion while at the same time obviously actively alienating the player.
Yeah.
And,
like when you give the player interactivity, I understand the impulse of, like, choice there, right?
Yeah.
Of, like, well, I can't control what the character does in the cutscene, but when you give me gameplay, I am controlling it, and it seems stupid that I can't do anything else. I understand that impulse a little bit, for sure.
And that's why I think it's I mean, not that all of these things aren't interesting, but it's interesting to me to consider that from the perspective of, I'm adding a game mechanic here to remind you that it's a game. Even though that what we are actually doing here is watching a movie for this moment, I'm reminding you that it's a game. You know, bring in my man Bertolt Brecht here. Brechtian alienation. Where are my theater fans in the house? But the idea of that by reminding the viewer that they aren't... By intentionally reminding the viewer that what they're watching is a performance, or in this case, what they're playing is a game, that you give them more opportunities to reflect on what they're playing is actually trying to say. And so, you know, obviously you can do that with things like QuickTime events there in cutscenes that would otherwise turn on movie brain. You can do that with... I'm really interested to see if developers start to use loading screens as an intentional thing. Like, obviously,
I will miss you.
But it's like, obviously they will continue to be included as just like a relic because people expect them and need a moment to check their phones when they're playing in games for the near-ish future. But I will be interested to see things like that, or things like the ability to actively choose to save your game, like save points, those kinds of things, being implemented as deliberate touches to be like, here's a moment to remind you this is a game. And, you know, same with interactive cutscenes that don't have choices, that just require you to interact. But I do think The Last of Us 2 is interesting because obviously it's not asking you... It doesn't really want you to root for the characters. I mean, it does. At points it does, but it's going to turn that on its head on purpose. And we totally accept that in television, right? I mean, maybe we're over it, right? Maybe the early 2010s anti-hero, Mad Men, Breaking Bad era, like, we're sort of done with. But that's more a matter of taste than our inability to empathize with characters that do things that we wouldn't do.
Yeah. And I do think that comes out a lot because of this identification, right? Or interaction, right? I'm used to embodying this character, and so in some way my brain is muddled up in which one is me. Which I do think is why, like, perspective switching in games is so interesting when it comes to identification, more than even, like you can change perspectives in a TV show or movie, but in a game you are actually then embodying two or more different characters, which increasingly muddles up the idea of, like, well, which one is me, right? And I think can help sort of emphasize what, like, well, none of these characters are you. You were just, like, playing their role for a little bit. Which I think both of The Last of Us do really well. And other games I've played have done really well in terms of, like, sort of muddying which character you're supposed to be identifying with.
Yeah, that is an interesting way to get around this like self-esteem tie-up, or this, you know, if you're the player that is coming to the game with the implicit desire to play something and feel competent, or to play something and get that, like, moral wash over you, or that courageous wash over you of playing the game, like, yeah, it makes sense why those people would then be turned off by that character doing something that makes them feel bad. That makes them feel like I've been like thinking of myself as this character, and, like, what does that mean that I thought of myself as this character that has now, I don't know, betrayed everyone they love, or something like that. What? I
mean, sorry, I was just thinking about, like, the Game of Thrones finale and everybody who named their child, like, Daenerys or whatever.
Yeah.
So you do run into that in different contexts too.
Yeah. It's definitely tied to that. That said, I am thinking, like, sometimes I think that perspective switching, so again, not to go back to my two series, the only two series games that I play, but also the two where I feel like I can clearly, in some cases, like, I'm not referring to things as I, right? But if I think of Kingdom Hearts Dream Drop Distance, and I think of Yakuza 0, my level of identification with the characters had more to do with which one was more fun to play. Like in Yakuza 0, and again, I came to Yakuza 0 as my first Yakuza game. I imagine my perspective on this would be somewhat different had I played it through in release order, or even in fake release order with the Kiwamis or whatever. And, like, I had some attachment to Kiryu going into it. But, like, it was way more fun to play as Majima. So I definitely identified more with Majima. Also, the story was just a little bit more coherent, and Kiryu's was much more tied up in, like, clan politics that
I guess so.
were very confusing.
Did you identify more with Majima, or did you just like Majima more?
So that's fair. Right? That's probably fair. Same idea with Dream Drop Distance, where it's like, oh man, at some point, like, one of my characters, I can't remember if it was Riku or Sora, but, like, one of them got way more powerful than the other. And again, it was just like, I enjoyed playing that character more because it was like the other one was far behind and it was hard. But I think maybe you're right. Maybe you're right to point out that in that case, I probably still would have sort of used I to identify myself in all four of those characters' playtimes. And there were just ones that I enjoyed more than others. But all this to say, if the perspective switch isn't super meaningful, in terms, like, if it doesn't actually change your perspective, I guess, that it doesn't always achieve that goal of achieving distance from one character, I guess. Not that either of those games want that for you, but I think I would continue to use I to refer to things throughout both of those stories, regardless of the fact that I was, like, switching between two people pretty frequently.
Yeah, I think those two are interesting examples because they're intertwined stories, but for most of it, they're pretty separate from each other.
They're both, I mean, with the exception of maybe the very end of Kingdom Hearts, they're, like, totally separate.
Yeah. So that does feel a little bit different, I guess. Versus when you're inhabiting different characters that are interacting in the same web of plot lines.
On the other hand, in things like Yakuza 4 and 5, where you play as 4 and 5 characters, I do think that I did a lot more of talking about, like, what is Haruka doing? What is Saejima doing?
Yeah.
Because there was such an overwhelming web that made it impossible to, like, really put yourself into one. Just kidding. I was Haruka. But...
Sure. Anyway.
So should developers just give up chasing this, Emma? Should we stop trying to... Yeah.
I mean, it depends on the type of game that you're developing. I think that games that play with identification more than just encouraging it are perhaps more interesting. I don't know, though. Make the player less powerful. That's my hot gamer take. I want less control. Less power, less control, please. That's what I like in my game.
Well, that's not what you get. Instead, we're going to meet the person throwing the blocks.
No.
Well, listeners, do you have characters that you really truly see yourself in? Or characters that make you kind of get into that flow state with the game? Are you someone that religiously refers to characters just by their names? You say, oh my gosh, Sonic missed that jump again. If you're that person, I want to hear from all ranges of perspectives on this. Do you, like Emma, want less control? Or do you want more control? Or do you want the exact same amount of control? What kind of characters do you design when you have a character creator? Is it just you? Is it you but slightly cooler? Or is it something else entirely? Or as Emma would say, you but way cooler. Where on the cool continuum do you design your characters? If you have thoughts on any of these things or anything else from the episode, you should hit us up on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also check out our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, see past episodes, check out the games that are in the hat for our main editions, and read our blog, featuring long-running series Clickbait Boyfriend, where I really should have gone back and seen if Josh referred to characters in the first person or third person throughout that blog as a case study. But I didn't. But you can, listeners. And Split Screen, where Emma and I do not refer to ourselves in the first person when watching I don't know what K-drama is on there right now. It's eventually going to be Crash Landing on You, but I think it's still Coffee Prince.
This week, I am planning big split-screen catch-up week.
So it's a good time to tune in for some TV watching fun. I saw an NPR post about North Korea that used a still from Crash Landing on You.
That's hilarious.
And I laughed. So check out Split Screen, check out Click Like Boyfriend, but more importantly, perhaps than any of that, although more important than Split Screen Catch-Up Week, that's debatable. But you should subscribe to the show. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts, online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts, anywhere that you can find podcasts, you can find Talk This. So subscribe so you never miss an episode on Sundays at noon Eastern, and maybe leave a rating and a review if you're feeling excited about this episode. If you're feeling like you... Let us know if you identify more with me or with Emma.
No.
When you listen to the pod.
Please don't.
It will be Emma. I identify more with you.
Thank you.
I'm like, who's this idiot talking to Emma? Next week, we are certainly talking about 2 games.
We are talking about Enslaved, Odyssey to the West, and Murder by Numbers.
So some really good games for player identification, I think.
Probably.
Make you feel good about yourself. And then in 2 weeks, Emma will be back here with some side quest fun. But
yeah.
Something themed.
Something.
So listeners, that's it for this week's show. Emma, do you want to try to say something relatable to sign them off?
Weather sucks, huh?